Let's rank my top 10 favorite Star Wars series. Welcome back. There are many Star Wars series now that you can stream on Disney Plus, so I wanted to take a few minutes to rank my top 10 favorites. I want to preface this with a couple things. One, I like all these shows, so this isn't like a worst to best rankings. This is just my preference from 10 to 1. And also, I haven't seen Resistance or Young Jedi Adventures, so it would not be fair to rank those having not seen them. So I'm going to be leaving them off the list. But if you like these, tell me what you like about them. But without further ado, let's hop in. Coming in at number 10, I have Star Wars Visions. Now this first came out a few years ago on Disney Plus. I believe it was a May the 4th release, and it's just a few short stories, maybe 8 or 10 short stories. It is a anime type series for Star Wars. It is certainly different. It's very creative, I will say that. I don't believe any of these stories are canon. They all take their own tones and tell pretty neat stories. Some are pretty deep, some are fun. It can go a lot of different ways with Visions. I really enjoyed the first season of Visions, but I did not care for the second season quite as much. So for that reason, I have it coming in at number 10 on my list. Coming in at number 9, I have The Bad Batch. The Bad Batch has 2 seasons with a season 3 on the way, hopefully this year, and it's really good. I really enjoy The Bad Batch. As you know, it follows a group of clones who are of a different variant than the traditional clone trooper, right? They don't necessarily look like Jango Fett. They all have their own little quirks and skills. They're essentially a special forces unit, and they're very fun to watch. So when the Empire comes into control, the Bad Batch are still good guys. They are not ones who turn on the Jedi. So the tension of that show really follows them living in a post-Republic world. They run into all kinds of trouble. Sometimes the episodes can draw on a little bit. They get on side quests that aren't necessarily that interesting. It is a kid's show primarily. As far as watching it, I may be in every other episode. I really enjoy it type of fan. But I will say it adds a ton to the story. So if you're skipping the Bad Batch, you are really missing out. And at number 8, I have the Clone Wars. Now I know there is an older Clone Wars series from Cartoon Network. I watched that as a kid growing up, but I'm really just focusing on this animated series for now. So the Clone Wars is great. It has really high highs, but its lows are kind of low for me as well. I have a hard time getting invested in some of the stories, some of the filler episodes. Now you get into the Mortis arc, you get into season 7, you get stories with Maul and Savage and Darth Sidious. You see the Siege of Mandalore later on. We're introduced to Ahsoka in the Clone Wars. I mean, you could go on and on about all the important things that are introduced in the Clone Wars. And we have Dave Filoni having that big of a hand in a project. You're going to have a lot of lore. So definitely check the Clone Wars out if you haven't, and let me know what your favorite episode is in the comments. At number 7, I have Andor. Andor is a pretty polarizing series, probably the most polarizing. I would say it is probably the Last Jedi's equivalency in the Disney Plus streaming series. A lot of people really love it, or a lot of people really hate it. There doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground. I really enjoy it. It's not one of my favorite Star Wars shows because its tone is a lot different. It doesn't really focus on the Force or the Jedi at all. But that doesn't mean it's a bad story. It does a lot of great world building. You see the politics of the rebellion. It's pretty interesting. Now, it's long, it's drawn out. Its budget is pretty high considering what other Star Wars series got, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with the take they took there to give all this money to Andor, with Kenobi getting a relatively low budget. But I still enjoyed the show. I think it was great. I love the characters that were introduced. The pacing was very well done. I mean, when these episodes build up to their arcs every few episodes, they really hit a home run every single time. So number 7, Andor. At number 6, I have the Book of Boba Fett. This show was really promising in the lead up to it, but then once the show started happening, you followed Boba Fett for a little while, but then it kind of turned into Mando season 2.5. Kind of took the light away from the Book of Boba Fett, but we see how he survived from Return of the Jedi. We see him setting up his dominion on Tatooine, taking over from Jabba the Hutt. We get some new characters. We see a lot about the Tusken Raiders that I wasn't really expecting to see. Plus, like I said, you get the Mandalorian, you get Ahsoka, you get Luke Skywalker. Those are great episodes. And then the ending when all the good guys are on the same side fighting on Tatooine, that's a great season finale. I really like that episode. So coming in at number 6, The Book of Boba Fett and Mandalorian season 2.5. At number 5, I have Star Wars Rebels. Rebels is a great story from start to finish. Again, it's an animated kids series, so you're going to have some episodes that just don't really appeal to you. But same with the Clone Wars. Dave Filoni did create this. He wrote it, directed it, whatever you want to call it. Dave Filoni's hand is very involved in this story. So there is a lot of important information about Star Wars as a whole that happens in Rebels. If you've seen Ahsoka and you're like, hey, I don't really understand some of this, it's probably because you didn't watch Rebels. Ahsoka was essentially a Rebels sequel, and Rebels is a really good show. We're introduced to so many great new characters. We have older characters in it like Leia, Lando, Ahsoka. We have Vader and the Emperor. It really doesn't let you down when it comes to the Star Wars feels. Plus the story arcs are great, they're important, and they really lead us into the original trilogy. Coming in at number 4, I have Kenobi. Now this series for me had so much potential, but it didn't necessarily focus on Obi-Wan all the way throughout. It focused a lot on Reva and the Inquisitors, which is fine. It's an interesting story, but this is Obi-Wan's story. Let's give him 90% of the story. So there are parts of it that I don't agree with. They didn't necessarily get the budget that I think this series deserved. So they did a lot of filming in the volume. It didn't all look quite right. And if you've seen it and you understand these complaints, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But that doesn't mean it's bad. It was great to see young Leia and young Luke Skywalker. The dynamics between Obi-Wan and Vader, Obi-Wan and Anakin are great. Hayden Christensen getting to make his return to the big screen of Star Wars was great to see. The final battle in Kenobi is one of the best lightsaber duels in all of Star Wars. Maybe not for the choreography, but for sure for the emotion and the story that it tells. So I have Kenobi at number 4. It's time for the top 3. If you haven't subscribed yet and you're still here, go ahead and subscribe really quick, but let's hop into the top 3. So coming in at number 3, I have Tales of the Jedi. It is another short story animated series that was released on Disney Plus. The stories are like 12 to maybe 16, 17 minutes each. Very short, but it is quality over quantity when it comes to time here. All of these stories are very well told. We follow Ahsoka on one hand from her infancy all the way up to her time between episodes 3 and then Rebels. We get the story of Count Dooku falling to the dark side. We see a young Qui-Gon. We have Anakin in it in some of the Ahsoka episodes. So it's a very good series, and you could sit down and watch all of the episodes probably in a couple hours, if not quicker than that. Now, getting into the top 2, I had a really hard time on which one I wanted as 1 and which one I wanted as number 2, but I had to look at body of work as a whole, and so that really did determine what I ranked number 2 and number 1. So coming in at number 2, I have Ahsoka. Ahsoka is the most I have ever looked forward to a Star Wars show, and it did not disappoint. We get Anakin Skywalker, we get Baylan and Shin, the two great new characters. I mean, Baylan really stole the show. We get Grand Admiral Thrawn, we go to a new galaxy, we see Jason Syndulla, Chopper's back, Hera's back. It had so much to like. Ahsoka being as great as it was, it receives my number 2 ranking. And coming in at number 1, you probably know at this point because there is only one more to talk about, and that would be The Mandalorian. I'm not sure that I've ever experienced anything quite like The Mandalorian Season 1. I have never been so invested in characters, particularly Grogu. Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni did a great job telling a story that doesn't necessarily focus on the Jedi to start with. It doesn't really seem to be focusing on anything except its own story to start. But then as more and more happens, you see this series is really going to shape where Star Wars goes in the future. It's very involved when it comes to having Ahsoka in the show, the Imperial Remnant. It's going to kind of tie into the sequel trilogy, I believe. It's going to lead into this Grand Admiral Thrawn New Republic movie. It gives us Luke Skywalker. We see Ahsoka in action. We have the return of Boba Fett. There is so much that happens in the first 3 seasons of The Mandalorian that will have a big impact in Star Wars going forward. Just running through my head, I forgot to even say the Darksaber. They return to Mandalore. We see a Mythosaur in season 3. I mean, there is so much, and I've probably still forgotten something. So those were my rankings. Tell me where I'm wrong. Tell me what your top 10 are, and watch one of these 2 videos next.